We're back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at the Federalist. As always, you can email the show at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel as well. Today, I'm really happy to be joined by Ryan T. Anderson. Ryan is the William E. Simon Senior Research Fellow in American Principles and Public Policy at the Heritage Foundation, where he researches and writes about marriage, bioethics, religious liberty, and political philosophy. Anderson is the author of several books, most notably in the context of the conversation we're about to have, When Harry Became Sally, which is a book that if you haven't already read, I assume a lot of you have read it, but if you haven't, you should absolutely check that book out. His research has been cited by 2 U.S. Supreme Court justices in 2 separate cases. Ryan, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you. Thank you for not mentioning that both of those U.S. Supreme Court cases were losses for my side.
But, that's kind of an important point because we are heading into the Biden administration, at least the conservative movement is heading into the Biden administration with what feels like a lot of cultural losses. And one of them came again on day one of the Biden presidency. Ryan has an article up in the Daily Signal that you can and should read. It's headlined, "After Inaugural Rhetoric on Unity, Biden Signs Divisive Transgender Executive Order." So Ryan, if you could start off just by providing background, what did this executive order do and why should people be concerned about it?
Sure. So most of our listeners probably remember at the very end of the Obama administration, it was in May of 2016, the Obama Department of Justice, Department of Education, and Health and Human Services all issued, in the case of DOJ and DOE, it was a Dear Colleague letter. And then in the case of HHS, it was a formal regulation in which they said the word sex now means gender identity. And then schools are going to have to redo their bathrooms, their locker rooms, and their sports policies. And then healthcare plans were going to have to pay for sex reassignment procedures. Doctors and nurses who normally perform the relevant types of procedures would have to do them in the case of transitioning, meaning that if you're a surgeon who does double mastectomies in the case of breast cancer, you'd have to do them for a woman who wants to transition and identify as a man. There were no religious liberty exemptions. There were no conscience protections. There were no considerations at all for just best medical judgment. And we litigated all of this, not we, lawyers litigated these things. They got injunctions. And then when the Trump people took office in January, no one was expecting that they'd win the election in November. Everyone thought that the Obama people would do this in May, and then Hillary Clinton would win in November, and then it would just be a fait accompli. But Trump won. And then Trump, when he took office, his attorney general, his secretary of HHS, his secretary of education, they undid all of this Obama era transgender agenda items. And now on day one, Biden's given them all back to us. And he can cite a Supreme Court case that gives his side a little bit better legal standing, although I don't actually think that Supreme Court justifies what he's doing, but he can, claim it does to buttress his argument. But more or less what you're going to see now is endless litigation for the next 4 years over female privacy when it comes to female-only spaces like bathrooms and locker rooms and homeless shelters, where males who identify as females say they now have a civil right to enter. We're going to see litigation on the behalf of high school athletes, frequently high school female athletes who are losing championship races to high school boys who identify as girls. We're going to see litigation from doctors and nurses. In one case, my childhood hospital in Baltimore was sued this past summer by the ACLU. And now we're going to see that the federal government will probably join that lawsuit because my childhood hospital was a Catholic hospital. They don't do sex reassignment procedures. And so when someone went there to get a hysterectomy performed and the hospital said no, they sued, right? So that's what we're going to see. We're going to see it's more or less going to be the Little Sisters of the Poor all over again, except not just on contraception and abortion causing drugs, but now on sex reassignment procedures, on athletics, on homeless shelters, on bathrooms. It's the culture war ramped up to the nth degree from the president who was talking all about unity and healing the nation.
And about his Catholic faith.
Of course. Yes. I mean, some of the there is some deep hypocrisy here, just because I don't know, has he done it yet? But the Mexico City policy is on the chopping block. I don't know if that happened today, or sometimes they wait to do it until tomorrow so they can celebrate Roe Wade by saying we're now going to pay for abortions overseas. And it's deeply, I'm Catholic. It's deeply troubling when you see someone who, claims to profess the faith while acting in ways that directly undermine it.
Well, and on top of that, I mean, there's sort of the policy issue itself here, and then it's also the ramifications for religious liberty. And
Yep.
I think that adds another layer to it when you talk about this particular executive order being one of the very first priorities of a, outspokenly, purportedly devoutly Catholic president. Can you talk a little bit about, you got into it just a bit there, but if you could expound on some of the challenges that this executive order may pose to religious liberty?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the first thing just to mention there is that, the underlying policy concerns will also be felt by anyone who shares that conviction, whether they're religious or not, right? So I don't think you need to be religious to not want to have a man in your bathroom if you're a female, right? And I just, it doesn't strike me as like a particularly religious concern to want to have a private place with only other females. And the same thing is true for these high school athletes. You don't need to be religious to think it's unfair to be losing a track championship to a boy who identifies as a girl, or it's unsafe. There have been MMA fighters, and one in particular where it's a man who identifies as a woman who's broken the eye socket of female MMA fighters. Right? It's a safety concern, and I don't think it's primarily just for like religious athletes that have these concerns, but it does raise religious liberty concerns because if you believe not only on the basis of science but also on the basis of revelation that we're created male and female, then when you try to run your religious institutions in accordance with that belief, you might now be on the wrong side of federal civil rights law. And we saw during the Democratic primary debates that Beto O'Rourke said that churches that don't support various aspects of LGBTism should lose their nonprofit tax status. Right? So if that's what he was saying out loud about churches, what happens to faith-based schools? Right? So what happens to the Catholic school, the evangelical school, the Latter-day Saint school, the Jewish school, the Muslim school that all believe that we're created male and female and then want to operate their school in accordance with that belief? Right? So there are going to be religious liberty concerns, there are going to be privacy concerns, safety concerns, equality concerns. And this isn't going to be healing or unifying. Right? It's going to be very divisive. And we're probably going to see these legal battles continue for all 4 years of this administration. I don't see them going away anytime soon.
You raised an interesting point. I think you raised this point on Twitter, which is that we started off here by mentioning the Supreme Court cases in your bio. Bostock. Why is that case not necessarily relevant when it comes to the implications of this executive order?
Yeah, sorry. So the fact pattern in Bostock is kind of important here. So what took place was that you had it's really the Harris Funeral Home case that's on target, but all the cases were consolidated, and Bostock was kind of like the first name there. But with Harris Funeral Home, you had a funeral director, biological male, identifying as a man for the first 6 years of his employment. I think he's 50, 60 years old. And then he gives a letter to his boss saying, in 2 weeks, I'm coming back and I'm going to be a woman. I'm going to be presenting as a woman. And then the boss terminates the employee. And Gorsuch held that that's discrimination on the basis of sex because a trait that you would tolerate in a female employee presenting as a woman, you wouldn't tolerate in a male employee presenting as a woman. Now, that logic, I think, is simplistic, right? I don't actually think it is discrimination to take seriously bodily differences when they make a difference, to take seriously the differences between men and women. But that, we lost that case, and Gorsuch ruled that it could be employment discrimination. He didn't say anything about what this means for privacy with respect to bathrooms, for equality with respect to athletic competition. When we banned discrimination on the basis of race, we got rid of black and white sports teams. When we banned discrimination on the basis of sex, we did not get rid of boys and girls teams or male and female teams. We actually thought that part of equality was the creation of female teams. So part of Title IX, the law that prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in education, was that you have to offer your female athletes equal opportunities as your male athletes. What the Biden executive order is now saying is that you have to allow your male athletes who identify as females to compete as if they are females. And that's not what Bostock says. It's not what it requires. It's why they're using it as cover to go where they wanted to go anyway. And the Trump administration did a good job of limiting Bostock. They refused to say that it had those consequences in education or in healthcare. There was a good memo that the Department of Justice prepared. And then, of course, the Biden administration is already committed on the policies, so they're using the legal justification to get there.
Right. And on top of that, you mentioned just before you answered that question in your preface that Bostock was kind of the umbrella case that involved also Harris Funeral Home. And that's a really, really important case. I actually think a lot of people don't know about that case. I don't think they know about how that case represents something that's happening around the country with the proliferation of this radical gender ideology, transgender ideology. So can you explain to listeners a little bit what the kind of concrete implications to women's sports, to institutions like funeral homes? Well, the funeral home case is kind of an interesting one, but how about women's shelters and places of business in general, like Harris Funeral Home? What can sort of this is something that was passed on the basis of an executive order, kind of like the changes to Title IX were passed on the basis in the Obama administration of a Dear Colleague letter. These are sweeping changes that are made on the basis, in this case, of an executive order. Concretely, how can people expect, maybe daily life or life in the business sector to change because of this?
Yeah, I mean, so I think concretely, as soon as in-person classes start happening again in your school district, I mean, it's really interesting to see that, like, it seems like a lot of the private schools are in person, but a lot of the public schools are still online, and it makes you wonder what role the teachers unions are playing in this, obviously. But as soon as you have in-person education again, you can expect that your bathroom policy, your locker room policy, and your athletic policy will be based on gender identity and not on biology. That what this is saying is that you're discriminating on the basis of gender identity if you don't affirm someone's gender identity, even if it goes against basic biology. Meaning that if I identify as a woman, I now have a civil right to use the women's restroom to play on the women's sports team. And the same thing would be true for the high school boy who identifies as a girl to use the girls' restroom, locker room, and play on the sports team. I think another particularly concerning part, let me read you a sentence from this. It says, children should be able to learn without worrying about whether they will be denied access to the restroom, the locker room, or school sports. So that's, what I just summarized there. Bathrooms, locker rooms, and sports are going to be based upon gender identity, not biology. And then next, people should be able to access healthcare and a secure roof over their heads without being subjected to discrimination. Now, what do they mean by that? They mean in the homeless shelter context, the housing situation is that if I'm a man who identifies as a woman, I get to stay at the women's homeless shelter. And the Alliance Defending Freedom has been representing a faith-based battered women's shelter that has been suing the city of Anchorage because there was a intoxicated man who showed up at midnight wanting to spend the night with the woman in the women's shelter. He identified as a woman, but that's cold comfort to the actual women because the homeless shelter, imagine a gymnasium where like every 3 feet is a cot. And you would be sharing that space. And there's a reason why we have single-sex homeless shelters, single-sex facilities. And so anyway, they called up a taxi, they paid cab fare, and they sent the individual to the men's shelter. And then he sued them, saying that that was discrimination on the basis of gender identity. That's what the Biden administration is getting at. And the last thing I'll say about healthcare, and I think this is most disconcerting when applied to children, is that the argument is going to be made that it's discrimination on the basis of gender identity if you don't affirm a child's gender identity, meaning giving that child puberty blocking drugs, cross-sex hormones, and possibly even surgery. And these are just highly invasive, highly, to my mind, unethical medical treatments. And we shouldn't be using our civil rights law to be imposing this sort of medical treatment policy as if it's not highly contested and highly debatable. We've now said that we've settled medicine on this, and it's not settled. And we just saw maybe a month ago, the UK High Court say that you can't do this anymore. And so while the UK is saying you can't do it anymore to minors, our government may very well be mandating it.
Right, and that's what I wanted to get into that, because you write about this in When Harry Became Sally. What are some of the, like if we're talking in the context of this executive order, one of the most frightening things is how decisions like this one can create legal precedent that leads to mandates. What does that slippery slope to mandates look like, particularly, let's say, in the context of this EO and other things that we can expect from this administration, including now that they have both houses of Congress and some Republicans actually support things, radical measures like the Equality Act, and perhaps the Equal Rights Amendment may see yet another new dawn under this administration. But what does that path look like?
Yeah, I mean, so here's a very concrete path. Section 1557 of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare, it prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex. When Congress passed Obamacare, what did they mean by no discrimination on the basis of sex? They meant you couldn't have different like healthcare options for men and women, where like men went to the front of the line and women had to wait at the back of the line, or your male employees got like the gold rated health insurance and your female employees got like the silver and bronze packages. They meant that you had to have equality. Men and women had to be treated equally with respect to healthcare. In May of 2016, the Obama administration said the word sex now means gender identity. And then they issued a regulation that said under this non-discrimination ordinance, you would now have to offer transition-related healthcare. Healthcare plans would have to pay for it. Hospitals would have to offer it. And the relevant doctors and nurses would have to perform it. That then got struck down by a federal judge back in, it was just before midnight 2016, because it was to go into effect on January 1, and on December 31st, a federal judge in Texas struck it down. The Trump people then did not contest that ruling. They then got sued. It just got struck down again earlier this week by a federal judge. But now the Biden administration's issued this executive order, right? And so under their interpretation of what this now means is that it's discrimination if a healthcare plan doesn't pay for these procedures, if a doctor doesn't perform it, if they have the requisite expertise, if a hospital doesn't offer it. It's the functional equivalent of a mandate. So it's kind of like the contraception mandate, but it's under the guise of non-discrimination law. If your hospital performs mastectomies and hysterectomies in the case of cancer, you have a cancerous uterus, you have cancerous breast tissue, and you would remove them, then you also have to remove them in the case of gender dysphoria. That's what that's the mechanism of how this mandate gets operationalized.
So am I laying out a nightmare scenario that's, implausible even in the context of the Biden administration's trans policies? If I say a parent who sends their child to a public school, their child may be in one of the phases of gender dysphoria, or at some level of gender dysphoria. Their child may be, it reads I Am Jazz, or the teacher reads I Am Jazz, and is kind of interested in what it would be like to identify as the other sex. And, for various reasons, maybe that's how they behave anyway. Should that parent be concerned that if the school diagnoses their child with gender dysphoria, they will be heavily pressured into using hormone treatments and using other permanent or irreversible, as Abigail Schreier would say, treatments going forward?
Yes, parents everywhere should be concerned because this is already taking place even without the Biden executive order. And here's what I mean by that. One of the things that I discovered when I was doing research for the When Harry Became Sally book was that there are model guidelines that various LGBT groups have made, model kind of like school policy guidelines that various school districts have voluntarily adopted. And one of them was, what to do with uncooperative parents. And what the guidelines say is, look, the privacy and the confidentiality of the student trumps the parental authority. And they had an entire checklist on how a student could socially transition at school without the parents knowing about it. So how you could have like a second wardrobe waiting for a child at school, how you could have, maybe you go to the nurse's office and you change out of one set of clothes and you change into a different set of clothes, how you could have two different sets of documents, one with the original name and pronouns and then one with the new name and pronouns. More or less how you could set up a school environment. The title of one of these handbook was titled Safe for Transition, right? So how you could set up a school environment that would be safe for transition for a student without the parents knowing anything about it. Now, I don't think the school itself can engage in any sort of medical treatment for kids, but you can now receive testosterone therapy at Planned Parenthood. And so it wouldn't be hard for a teenage girl without their parents' knowledge to see a kind of pro-transitioning doctor who would then refer them or prescribe them testosterone, which they could then get at Planned Parenthood. And several parents have told me that this is how their teenage daughters transition. Abigail Schreier's book is wonderful on this. And these are just heartbreaking stories. And then the last thing I'll say is that, and many parents have been guilt-tripped into this. They are told by the, quote, gender experts, better to have a living son than a dead daughter. And so parents who have, a high school daughter who's struggling with gender dysphoria are being told, if you don't give her testosterone, she'll commit suicide. And so better off. And then the way they'll say, if you don't give him testosterone, because they'll say that she already is a boy on the inside. And so all you're doing is you're affirming the real self. There is no evidence that this benefits patients. The best evidence that we have is actually that it doesn't benefit patients in the long run, that it's actually, you're just reinforcing a faulty self-image. And it's much better to figure out why someone feels uncomfortable in their body and then help them to feel comfortable in their body rather than trying to transform the body to align it with misguided thoughts and feelings. But yet this might be now the required treatment path under our civil rights law.
Right. And why do you think it is? I mean, first of all, what is the research on suicide rates? Because that is what is cited over and over again. And I can imagine if you're a parent, what level of pressure that exerts onto you in conversations with school leaders and wherever else. What is the research on the suicide rate? And then on top of that, why is it this is something I imagine you think about all the time and have been thinking about for years, I know. And you've spoken, of course, with some doctors and academics who are not political conservatives or Republicans or partisans. Why is it that so much of the medical industry, so many doctors make statements like it's better to have an alive son than a dead daughter? Why has the medical industry, the $1 million question here, why have doctors sort of swallowed this bad science entirely?
So those are great questions. I think part of it has been a lack of courage. If you were to just poll, the majority of doctors would not be on board with this, but they see what the costs are of speaking out. And thank God there are increasing numbers of doctors who are willing to speak out. And I know some of them have written for the Federalist. Some of them have formed various kind of like reaching across the aisle, both political conservatives and political liberals, both religious doctors and secular doctors. I mean, there's a whole host of medical experts, some of whom are in favor of adults transitioning, who are, very skeptical of what's happening to children right now. And so there are physicians willing to speak out to say, look, I have no problem with Bruce becoming Caitlin, but no one under the age of 18 should be encouraged to transition. We should always be trying first and foremost to help people reconcile with their bodily reality. And only as a last resort and only for adults when everything else has failed should we be contemplating transitioning, right? So it's really been fascinating to watch how networks of physicians, both kind of on the political left and the political right, people who aren't particularly political at all, some religious, some secular, and then also some LGB separation from the T. And there was a tweet today from the LGB Alliance in the United Kingdom responding to the Biden's executive order. I've partnered with some people who disagree with me about more or less everything else I believe in life, but agree with me that biology isn't bigotry. And I was able to host 2 events at Heritage featuring, in one case, it was the first lesbian reinstated to the U.S. military after Don't Ask, Don't Tell was lifted. And she was saying being a woman is a reality. It's not an identity. And my being a woman and my being a lesbian never harmed a child, never required pumping a child full of synthetic hormones, and that the T is very different than the LGB. And so I think what's happened is that some physicians who specialize in kind of like transgender medicine, it's a self-selected group, right? So you major in like women's studies, and you go to medical school wanting to be a gender expert. There's a little bit of kind of self-selection there. And then the other doctors, not everyone has Paul McHugh's courage. And for our listeners who aren't familiar with McHugh was a Harvard undergrad, Harvard Medical School trained doctor. He was hired by Johns Hopkins, eventually promoted psychiatrist in chief at the hospital and chair of psychiatry at the med school. And in 1979, he shut down the sex reassignment clinic because they had been doing this since the 60s. He said, let's do a long-term study. What's happened over the past 20 years in these people's lives? It didn't improve things for them. And he said, as the psychiatrist in chief, I can't sign off on these surgical mutilations of people's bodies as if it's actually going to benefit their psychosomatic wholeness. Hopkins reopened that clinic. I think it's now 4 years ago. And nothing changed with human nature. There was no compelling evidence that this was actually benefiting people. In fact, some of the best evidence we have is that it actually makes things worse. And so anyway, I do think doctors are increasingly speaking out, and we can expect that to continue. The UK court ruling is really good in this respect that you had. For people who aren't familiar with this, it's the Kiara Bell case, someone who I believe she was 17 years old when she started receiving testosterone. And then at age 22, so 5 years later, she detransitioned and she sued. She said, I was a minor, and what you adults did to me was unfair, unjust, unethical. And the courts have agreed. Right? Unfortunately, in the US, we're not there yet.
Were you surprised by the ruling in that case?
I would only in one sense. I wasn't surprised on the merits, right? Because like in terms of like the arguments, the facts, the figures, the realities, like we're on the side of reality in this debate. I was surprised that the UK court acknowledged that so soon. My fear was that we were actually going to have like an entire generation of young people transition and then detransition and then file the lawsuits before we had action. And so it's very, very encouraging that it did happen on a much more accelerated timeline in the UK. Hopefully something similar can happen here because the longer this continues, the more lives that will be damaged.
So this is a perfect segue into one thing I absolutely wanted to ask you, and it's related to what Schreier documented in Irreversible Damage. We've been talking a lot about sort of the concrete legal consequences and some of the very obvious direct consequences of policies like this executive order. But Irreversible Damage documents something that's a little bit murkier, which is the psychological effect that's sort of marinating in a culture that treats biology in the way that informed this executive order and in the way that informs so much of our popular culture, so much of academia, so much of our human resources departments at major corporations. What in your sort of, in the best way that you can kind of imagine this, and best isn't meant to be positive, but what do you think those sort of less tangible psychological effects look like?
Yeah. So, I mean, a couple of thoughts on that. I mean, one is just that it's an embrace of like the ancient heresy of Gnosticism or body self dualism. The idea that the real self is some immaterial psyche that just inhabits a body. Rather than what both Aristotle and the Christian tradition teaches us, right? So you can do it both from a purely philosophical or theological viewpoint, which is that we are embodied beings, that the body isn't just a costume, it's not just a vehicle. it's who we are. I'm a bodily person. You're a bodily person. It's an essential intrinsic aspect of our humanity. It's not just like a costume or clothing or a vehicle, something like you can take on and take off and change at will. Where like, the body is just like raw, silly putty, and you can manipulate it however you want. Like, I think that's part of this. I also think, and you might, Emily, you might speak better to this than I can, but I just think in our culture today, it's really hard to be a girl developing into a woman, which is why it's not surprising at all to me that gender dysphoria, whereas it historically had been a much more prevalent phenomenon amongst men identifying as women. What Abigail Schreier's documented is, I think it's a 4,000 time increase in the number of high school and college girls who are presenting with gender dysphoria. And it's not at all surprising to me that in a culture that is pretty toxic place. I have a daughter, and when I think about like raising her to develop into a woman, it's more challenging to do that today than it had been in the past, and for a variety of reasons. And so it's not surprising that you would see women feeling uncomfortable being women, and so. And the problem's not with their bodies, right? I mean, like that's probably like the bottom line thing is that like the problem is not with the person's physical reality. And the question for a good therapist is to identify, well, what is the root cause of your discomfort with your body? And it could be a variety of factors. And a good therapist is able to figure out, what is it maybe about societal expectation on women that you don't think you can live up to? And maybe the problem's not you, it's the societal expectation. And so part of like the healthy treatment plan here is helping you to see that, look, that's not an expectation that you should take seriously. You should reject an unhealthy expectation rather than rejecting your body. Right? And the analogy that Dr. McHugh uses is with anorexia or with eating disorders, body image problems, no physician worth his or her salt prescribes liposuction to an anorexic high school student because the problem's not with her body. But no case of anorexia is the same. Every individual is unique. And what the good therapist does is figure out, why is this particular high school girl feeling either uncomfortable in her body or having a body image problem or having a control issue with food. Like sometimes it's an eating disorder per se, where it's much more about control with respect to food. Sometimes it's a body image struggle per se. And then it could be from mothers, boyfriends, other girls at school. I mean, there's a variety of people who could be placing unrealistic expectations on those girls. And you try to get to the bottom of it, and then you address your intervention at that root cause, not by tinkering with the body. And so I just think some of this, we can draw parallels to help people think about, like, if you wouldn't do it in that case, why would you do it in this case? And should we be using our civil rights law to say that one side of this debate is the legal equivalent of Jim Crow, right? Because that's what just happened yesterday with this executive order. And to my mind, like, after all the rhetoric about unity and healing, I was like, all right, well, it's pretty divisive to say that one side of a disagreement is actually discriminating.
Mm-hmm.
Not having a good faith disagreement, but you're actually, engaged in the type of discrimination that the Civil Rights Act of '64 was passed to combat. Right? Go ahead.
I was going to say, that's such an important point. That's actually what I wrote about in response to the inaugural, is that they set up this binary. It's not that, like, you can disagree in good faith over a political conflict. It's actually that if you dissent from any element of leftist dogma, you are necessarily a bigot. And why would you be civil, and why would you be peaceful, and why would you be kind to white supremacists and sexists and violent people? Because that's the argument that gets made in this case. I mean, Ryan, you are an extremely violent man.
I mean, that's exactly right. That the rhetoric that the left uses to advance their policy priorities is really important. So when they say you have blood on your hands, which is like regularly something that people on Twitter will accuse me both about my views about the nature of marriage, that it unites man and woman, husband and wife, mother and father, or about, bodily reality, is that therefore anytime someone is violently assaulted, gay bashing or something, you're responsible for that. And that just isn't true, right? I mean, so the idea that we can't have good faith disagreements about either the nature of marriage or the nature of our embodiment without saying, and the other side of the debate is there for Hitler, right? I mean, it's deeply problematic when one side claims, we're going to be the party of civility and unity while using rhetoric that does demonize the other side, or then uses a law that treats them as discriminators, not just people with a disagreement. And so we should call that out. Like, I think, one of the things that I think people found attractive about Donald Trump was that he didn't succumb to those sorts of bullying tactics, right? Whatever you want to say about his presidency, whatever you want to say about him as a man, I think one thing people found attractive was that he saw through some of that, and it didn't cower him. And many of our elected officials are afraid, right? They're afraid of being called a bigot, and then they go silent. And that's our cultural, political problem, is that we don't have enough prominent officials wanting to say the emperor has no clothes on these issues.
Yeah, and this is a conversation we've had a lot of times on this program, in the way that sort of the populism that Trump channeled on a cultural level, even on a temperamental level, has reshaped the Republican Party. And you really do have a front row seat to this in the work that you do, because the work you do is what Republican politicians were terrified to touch. It's what the 2012 autopsy commissioned by Reince Priebus disavowed. And so I'm wondering if you think, for example, Mike Pence, say Mike Pence was governor of Indiana again. Do you think he backs down on RFRA in the same way in this sort of like post-Trump era?
I hope not, right? I mean, I hope that if we can learn the right lessons from the Trump phenomenon, it's that caving is not a political virtue, right? It's that if we had some political leaders who said, look, these are my people are not bigots, they're not a basket of deplorables, they're not bitter clingers, what my people believe not only is true, but even if you disagree with it, it's still not beyond the pale, right? So even if you don't believe that we're created male and female are created for each other, there's no reason why you should think that viewpoint is, discriminatory or bigoted or crazy or whatever. And I'm going to defend my people. I would love it if, the takeaway of this is some political courage on the part of the elected officials who were elected to represent these people. When you look at the scatter plot, everyone has been sharing this for the past 4 years. The quadrant that is empty is the quadrant represented by like the chattering class and the DC consultants, right? The socially liberal but fiscal conservative quadrant. Like, that's a non-existent quadrant. Where were all the red dots? It was fiscally moderate and socially conservative, right? It was the top two quadrants. So it spanned the spectrum on economic questions, but it was all above the fold on social questions. That's the future of any electorally successful Republican Party and conservative movement, right? It's how to have an economic agenda that supports working class people, that supports families, while not giving up on the social issues that we care most about: the sanctity of life, that we're made in the image and likeness of God, that the nature of marriage itself being a key to civil society, our embodiment as male and female. I would love it if we got some political leaders who learned that lesson, and not just repeating libertarian economic talking points, right? This is what we need moving forward.
Well, and who's, in the hardest position to push back against trans ideology, for instance, is working people who can't afford to lose their jobs because of it. So a lot of this is an agenda for the working class and for people who need that sort of support to address that.
And who can't opt out of the government-run schools. I mean, realize that, one of the luxuries of wealth is that while, all sorts of crazy stuff is happening at the government-run public schools, and you get to send your kids to the $40,000 a year private academy, ordinary people don't have that luxury. Their only option is the local school. And if the local school this is why I think I love school choice. We should expand school choice. We should have more vouchers, more education savings account, all that. But we also have to be concerned with what the government-run schools are doing, because the majority of kids attend those schools. And it's unfair to those kids and to those parents if they're being indoctrinated in gender ideology, if they don't have private, safe facilities, if they don't have equal athletic opportunities. We can't kind of just say, oh, well, we're giving up on the public schools and let's just focus on school choice and religious liberty or something like that. We need to be comprehensive in our response, because the left is being comprehensive, right?
Yeah. So this is this could be another like very long conversation, but a quick, since it's related to what we were just talking about. You know, the Republican Party wouldn't have touched a lot of these trans issues before, you know, what happened with Trump. And Trump, in some ways, was a reaction to overreaching on the Obama administration's part. But in 2020 and 2021, we saw Kelly Lefler running ads on, you know, Title IX and on women's sports. Do you think that there's any way a similar pattern could repeat with marriage at some point? Is there any, you know, putting the genie back in the bottle when it comes to marriage?
Not in the short run. I mean, I think that just as a political reality, in the short run, the best we can hope for is that people who believe the truth about marriage, that it unites husband and wife, are not treated in any way as like second-class citizens. That they're free to run their businesses, their charities, their schools in accordance with that belief. And people who disagree with them already are free to run their businesses, their schools, and their lives in accordance with their beliefs, right? So I think in the short run, I don't see Obergefell being overturned. I don't see politicians running with that. I think what we do need, though, are politicians willing to say that Jack Phillips, the baker, should be free to run his bakery in accordance with his beliefs, that Catholic adoption agencies should be free to find kids moms and dads, and they don't need to be shut down because they don't do same-sex adoption. And then, I mean, what was great about Kelly Lefler is not only did she run ads about that, she introduced legislation, right? She was one of those lawmakers who actually realized that their job is to make law. And she wrote a bill and she introduced it that would have said that, no, Title IX means biological sex. You can't discriminate on the basis of biological sex. And that means you can't let boys compete against girls. Like, you actually have to have, in order to have equal athletic opportunities for women, you have to have women-only athletic competitions. I would love to see more of that. I would love to see, there's another bill, if I remember correctly, it was introduced by Representative LaMalfa, which said no experimental medicine for transitioning on minors. These are, to my mind, appropriate uses of government authority to protect the welfare of children, to protect equality, and conservative members of Congress shouldn't be afraid of doing this, because it actually, one, it's the right thing to do, and it'll be politically attractive. Right? This is one of those nice instances in which the right thing to do is also the politically smart thing to do.
Right. I couldn't agree more with that. My last question for you is, what happened last year is we saw like J.K. Rowling come out sort of full-throatedly against the excesses of trans ideology. Is it getting easier for writers like you, for Deborah Soh, for Abigail Schreier, for J.K. Rowling? I mean, this isn't to downplay the magnitude of the opposition you get, but has the sort of like slow stream of defections from the far left, has that made anything easier? Do you think it indicates that the tide might be changing at all? Or do you think it's just sort of like, you know, people are out there saying things, but there's really no way?
Yeah, I mean, so yes and no. I think it's made it easier in this sense that it's encouraged more people, you know, giving courage, right? It's inspired more people who agree with us to find their voice and to speak out. But I don't think in any way it has softened the opposition. Look at the backlash against Andrew Sullivan and J.K. Rowling and others, when, you know, people, you know, Andrew Sullivan, one of the, you know, pioneers of gay rights, is now being denounced as, you know, a transphobic bigot, right? Like, that's the reality there. Abigail Schreier's book was taken off, you know, from Target and Amazon, this, that, and the other thing. And that was all under big business felt free to do that while Trump was in office. What is big business and big tech going to feel free to do for the next 4 years? Right? And so this is why I mean yes and no. On the one hand, I think it has encouraged more people to not be afraid to speak out. It hasn't softened any of the opposition. And I actually now think that with Biden in office, it's going to embolden some of the censorship, some of the silencing. And that's just not going to be good, because we have to be able to have these conversations. Right? It's important that our side engages in them in a respectful manner, right? You won't see me or Abigail or Deborah or anyone else engaging in inappropriate rhetoric. But even so, right, that's not good enough for the left because it's not how we say it, it's what we're saying. Right? It's the bottom line viewpoint is what they disagree with. It's not about being nice or anything like that.
Literally nothing is good enough short of full agreement with their total agenda.
Yes. Yep. That's how we're going to find unity. If you all just agree with me, then we can have unity. I mean, that's
so easy.
Yes. Yeah. Problem solved.
Right. No, it really is that easy. Ryan, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, of course. Happy to do it.
So the article is on the Daily Signal. You can read it there. We'll link it here. But after inaugural rhetoric on unity, Biden signs divisive transgender executive order. That's by Ryan T. Anderson, who you've been listening to. You can follow him on Twitter at Ryan T. And we'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.